Previously, we have covered several key economic indicators. First, we talked about output, which is normally measured by GDP. We also talked about various measures of income. Today, we are going to talk about another key economic indicators, unemployment rate. I'm sure when you heard the word unemployed, many of us know what it means. But in our daily conversation, we tend to define unemployed very loosely. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is the government agency that is in charge of collecting and calculating unemployment rate, simply because a person doesn't have a job does not automatically qualify him as unemployed. Okay? So in order to be counted as unemployed, a person has to be actively looking for a job. Okay? So in other words, this person has to be in the labor force to begin with. Okay? Unemployment rate is a percentage of people in the labor force who do not have a job but are actively looking for one. Take, for example, retired people. Retired people, they don't have a job, but they are not considered unemployed because they are not in the labor force to begin with. They are not actively looking for a job. And then we have also housewives. Okay? So housewives don't have a job per se. Okay? However, they are not in the labor force to begin with. So they are not considered unemployed. And then there's a group of people who are young, who are healthy enough to potentially contribute to the labor force. Okay? But they don't have a job and they are not actively looking for one. What do you call them? I mean, just for fun, what do you call them? In the many semesters that I teach, very often I get the answers, lazy people. That's not politically correct. So the word that we use here is discouraged workers. So discouraged workers are workers who are of legal employment age, okay? But they don't have a job. They are not actively looking for a job. That means that they have completely dropped out of the labor force. Well, this is usually because an individual has given up looking or has had no success in finding a job after a long time. So finally they give up. Okay? So these people are not considered unemployed either, and because they are not in the labor force. So we keep saying labor force. So what is the labor force? Labor force includes everybody who is 16 years old or older. Obviously, if a person has a job, then this person is definitely in the labor force. But if he doesn't have a job, but he has been actively looking for one, then he is also in the labor force. So everybody who's over 16 years old, who either has a job or who is actively looking for one. Another economic indicator, which is not the same as unemployment rate, however, it is also a key economic indicator of the labor market. So something aside, okay, which is labor participation rate. Labor participation rate is calculated by dividing the size of labor force by the population. And if you want it in percentage, you multiply the whole thing by 100%. So what that says is the fraction of populations that can potentially contribute to the labor force that is in the labor force. So it is an important economic indicator in the sense that if the labor participation rate is too low, it is alarming, because what that means is this economy may not have enough people working to contribute or to support the population. So this usually happens in an aging economy. So for example, Japan may be worried about this problem, and because there are just too many older people, they are retiring, there are not enough young people to support the entire economy. Okay? So people don't want to get married, or if they get married, they don't want to have children. Okay? So the United States, by the standard of a developed country, has fairly healthy labor participation rate. It used to be over 70%, which is extremely healthy. But after 2008, we started to observe a decline. It is still okay now, but it is on a decline. It is in the 60s now. So this is something that policymakers may want to pay attention to. So now let's talk about some of the effects, some of the implications of unemployment. I'm sure very few people will argue against the notion that unemployment is bad, but let's talk about how that will affect individuals. So let's take a minute or so, and let's take about 2 minutes. Okay? 2 minutes to think about how unemployment can affect individuals. Let's put aside the bigger economy. Let's just talk about how unemployment can affect individuals and families. So let's take a couple of minutes. Okay, so obviously, when you think about how unemployment can affect individuals and families, so if a person loses his job, cannot find a job, the most direct effect is probably a loss of income. So if there's a loss of income, this person cannot provide for the family. So cannot put bread on the table, put food on the table. So no more vacations. Okay. So obviously there's a lower standard of living. Okay. Okay. Cannot afford to spend. And also when you think of some of the sociological issues, usually when there is high unemployment, the crime rate is also high, which is easily understandable because if a person cannot put food on the table, he may get desperate. He may resort to some illegal channels. So high crime rate in the neighborhood. And also some of the psychological effects. Many studies have shown that people who have been unemployed for a prolonged period of time are likely to experience distress or even worse, psychological problems. Like it or not, in the society that we live in today, we tend to identify ourselves with our job. When you go out there and meet a person for the very first time, one of the first few things that is likely to come up in the conversation is, what do you do? Okay? So if a person doesn't have a job for a prolonged period of time, that really affects the person negatively, psychologically. So there's a psychological distress. So that's the effect on individuals and families. So now let's turn to the macro economy. So just now we talk about loss of income, and then families, individuals cannot afford to spend. So if there is no spending, so obviously that affects businesses. Okay, so and then when there is no businesses, when businesses don't do well, okay, there is no revenue. Okay? So there is no revenue, no profits. So there's even less hiring. So we have this vicious cycle there. Okay? And also, in a welfare economy like the United States, when there is a high unemployment rate, many people don't have a job. They tend to have to rely on welfare, and that's a burden on the government. And to quantify the macroeconomic effect, an economist called Okens collect data of many countries for a long period of time, and then carry out a statistical analysis, okay, construct some econometrics models to estimate the effect of unemployment on potential output. So Okun's law, obviously this is an estimate. It doesn't really apply to all countries all the time. So according to Okens, every 1% loss in unemployment rate, okay, sorry, every 1% increase in unemployment rate can lead to approximately 2% decline in potential output. So what is the potential output? For now, let's think of it as long-term output. So that's a very brief discussion of the implications of unemployment. Now let's go to the calculation. So this is how we calculate the unemployment rate, the number of people who are unemployed divided by the size of the labor force. Okay, so be very careful here. The denominator is the size of the labor force, not the size of the populations, because we are not looking at the entire population. We are only counting people who are in the labor force. So unemployment rate usually is expressed in percentage, so we multiply the whole thing by 100%. So let's work on a very short exercise. So in this very simplified economy, so let's make a couple of assumptions to narrow down some possibilities. We assume that everybody is older than 16 years old in this hypothetical economy. And also in school, I mean students, we also assume that students are not actively looking for a job. Okay, I know, I mean, in reality, many of you would argue that students also look for a job. But here, let's just simplify things by assuming that students don't look for a job. Okay? So given all this information, let's try to calculate the labor force. Okay? So let's give it a few minutes. So when you look at all these groups of people, what can you make of it? What do they have in common? So we have retired people, we have homemakers. Homemakers are just a political correct terms for housewives, okay? Because we can have house husbands too, right? So then students in school, sick and disabled, institutionalized. Institutionalized people include people who are in the prisons, who are in mental institutions, and so on and so forth. Okay? And then we're given the total population. So when you look at these groups of people, I'm sure you notice that they do share something in common. They are people who are not in the labor force. So these people, they are not in the labor force. They are not actively looking for a job. So in order to find those who are in the labor force, what we can do here is we can use the total population and then minus those who are not in the labor force. When you add them up together, what you have is 200 and then 80, right? And then you get 120. Okay? So we have 120 million people who are in the labor force. So now let's move on to the calculation of unemployment rate. So we are given this total population, we're given the size of the labor force, and here in this case, things are made slightly simpler for us. We are given the number of unemployed people. So that means we don't have to determine who is unemployed and who is not unemployed, who is not unemployed here. So let's calculate the unemployment rate. So let's give it 2 minutes. So you can pause. So you can pause for a few minutes and then we'll come back to that. Okay, we can come back to that. So when you look at the information to calculate the unemployment rate, all we need to do is to have the number of people who are unemployed, which is 12 million here, divided by the size of the labor force. So that's 120 that's given to us. And then we multiply the whole thing by 100%. So that's 10%. So that's the unemployment rate.